Thank you for joining us on the program. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos. We begin with President Volodymyr Zelensky asking G7 leaders for more air defense weapons, and the mayor of the capital, Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, has been making the same point. The former heavyweight boxing world champion said yesterday that air defense is their main priority, and a couple of the big cities like Kharkiv, Lviv have been without water and electricity after Russian missile strikes hit critical infrastructure across the country for a second day. According to them, yesterday was the massive attack to their home, Kyiv. The majority of rockets were shot down by Ukrainian forces, but a couple of rockets destroyed their infrastructure and their buildings. The reports from Ukraine authorities said 7 of the 19 people who died in yesterday's missile strikes were killed in Kyiv, while 51 were injured. 42 are still in hospital. According to him, Russia says this is a special operation against military forces, but rockets landed in children's playgrounds in the middle of the city, close to the university. He says it's destroying historical buildings, and Russians are trying to bring panic, but their people are ready to defend their country. In the meantime, President Vladimir Putin has said that Russia was not working against anyone on energy markets a week after Washington criticized a decision by OPEC Plus to steeply cut oil production. Speaking as he met the president of the United Arab Emirates, Mr. Putin said Russia aimed to create stability on energy markets and ensure that supply and consumption were balanced. The Kremlin on Sunday praised OPEC Plus for agreeing production cuts that it said had successfully countered the mayhem sown by the United States in global energy markets. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials reported more strikes today, including one in the southeastern zone of Zaporizhia, which killed at least one person, although they did not appear to be a repeat of Monday's nationwide attacks. Zaporizhia's governor, Alexander Staruk, said 12 missiles hit the city. A local video showed a destroyed car dealership and a residential building behind with blown-out windows. Zaporizhia, Ukraine's sixth largest city, has remained under Ukrainian control throughout the war, despite Russia occupying most of the surrounding province, among 4 partially occupied regions that Moscow claims to have annexed this month. Apartment blocks there have been struck overnight at least 3 times in the past week, killing civilians while they slept. Moscow has denied intentionally targeting them. And Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has inspected the field training of newly mobilized reservists at the training range in the country's western military district. The Defense Ministry reported that Mr. Shoigu inspected the tactical and fire training of reservists who are about to face fighting in Ukraine and listened to reports from Deputy Defense Minister General Yunusbek Yevkurov and other military commanders. Shoigu instructed Defense Ministry officials to engage seasoned officers in the training process. On October 4, Shoigu announced that over 200,000 people have already been drafted into Russia's armed forces since Vladimir Putin ordered a partial mobilization the 21st of September. He also added that he planned to enlist 300,000 men with previous military experience to bolster what Russia calls its special military operation in Ukraine, where it has suffered a series of defeats in recent weeks. However, the official decree did not include a figure, and officials are keen to allay public fears that the actual number could be higher, even as pro-Kremlin figures voice concern that people are being recruited indiscriminately. Tens of thousands of men are seeking to avoid the draft have already fled abroad, and the public remains concerned that the mobilization could be expanded. And for the United Nations, Russia may have committed war crimes during attacks that rained cruise missiles on busy Ukrainian cities on Monday, killing civilians and knocking out power and heat. Spokesperson for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights said that it is unconscionable. Missiles tore into intersections, parks and tourist sites in the capital, and explosions were reported in Lviv, Ternopil and Zhytomyr in western Ukraine, Dnipro and Kremenchuk in the center, Zaporizhzhia in the south, and Kharkiv in the east. The OHCHR spokeswoman, Ravina Shamdasani, said at least 12 civilians were killed and more than 100 injured, adding that the location and timing of the strikes when people were commuting to work, taking children to school, is particularly shocking.
The fact that it seems that energy facilities were targeted as well, and some of these facilities may be indispensable to the survival of the civilian population just ahead of the winter months as the weather is getting colder, as we've seen stories of elderly people trapped in their homes, people with disabilities who are also unable to flee. I mean, this is unconscionable. We have to stress that intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, that is, objects which are not military objectives, amount to a war crime. The missile attacks by Russian armed forces yesterday, which struck cities across Ukraine, left at least 12 civilians dead and more than 100 injured in Kiev, Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, and in the Kiev and Sumy regions. The location and timing of the strikes, when people were commuting to work and taking children to school, is particularly shocking. We are gravely concerned that some of the attacks appear to have targeted critical civilian infrastructure. Many civilian objects, including dozens of residential buildings and vital civilian infrastructure, including at least 12 energy facilities, were damaged or destroyed in 8 regions, indicating that these strikes may have violated the principles on the conduct of hostilities under international humanitarian law. Attacks targeting civilians and objects indispensable to the survival of civilians are prohibited under international humanitarian law. We urge the Russian Federation to refrain from further escalation and to take all feasible measures to prevent civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. Our human rights monitoring mission in Ukraine will continue corroborating information on civilian casualties resulting from these attacks, as well as documenting violations of human rights and international humanitarian law throughout the country.
In Sloviansk, 4 people were killed as a result of a Russian missile strike, this according to Ukraine's police. Video released by Donetsk region police showed people clearing the rubble and distressed local residents crying near raised buildings. The police representative said at the scene 4 civilians were killed as a result of the shelling. Another 2 were affected. Among the affected is a 12-year-old child. Russian troops shelled the private sector of Sloviansk's central part around 1 a.m. local time using S-300 anti-aircraft missile system against civilians.
Пацан лежит у нас в 6-й палате. Мы же говорим, многократно говорим о том,
Well, we've said it many times, that we never refuse meetings. And if there's another offer, then we will consider it. Because if everyone thinks that a signal for such a meeting has been given by US President Joe Biden, then that confidence that a signal has been given, as I understand it, is based solely on his phrase, "We will see." From when he asked, "Will you meet Putin in the future?" he said, "We'll see." Well, this is probably more for journalistic analytical fabrication.
And that you just heard from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who said that Moscow was open to talks with the West on the Ukraine conflict, but had yet to receive any serious proposal to negotiate. He was speaking in an interview with state television. Well, joining us for more on the situation is Anna Chernikova, VOA's Anna Chernikova. She joins us from Kyiv. Anna, it's good to see you. How are you, considering we spoke to you yesterday when the missile strikes were downed in Kyiv and other cities? First, talk to us. How did you and people in Kyiv get through last night?
Good evening. Well, situation in the evening was more or less calm. So it was no air alarm, and people had and electricity in Kyiv was on, so it was not I should say it was not really a problem in the evening, despite of all the stress that people of course had from what happened during the day. Today, however, over the night it was okay, but at 7 o'clock in the morning, air raid siren was on again. So people, of course, were very well on the alarm. Let's put it this way. And the air raid siren today in the morning was for another 5 hours. So it was another tough morning, well, morning and afternoon. But Kyiv was not hit today. There were missiles targeting Kyiv, but they were destroyed in the air. So I should say that in general, situation is normal in the capital. People continue to go to work. Everything is working. I mean, stores, everything, basically all the civilian infrastructure which is needed for normal life. All the rubbles are from the streets are gone, and also the road where we were speaking yesterday, it was a huge hole in the road with damages of the water supply system. Today it's already repaired, and vehicles are already passing this boulevard road easily. So there is no chaos, there is no panic in the city. Kyiv continues to live, and well, of course, on the alarm, because there is still a high risk of attacks. But for the moment, the situation is fine.
And also, Anna, how true is what Russia said, that its armed forces continued hitting objects of Ukraine's military and also energy infrastructure, especially today?
Well, we do not have any information about military targets. So the main target continued to be critical infrastructure, energy infrastructure in particular. And what we can see today is that there were Lviv, Vinnytsia, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and Donetsk regions affected today, where missiles actually hit. Lviv region again was under heavy shelling today, and there were at least 3 hits. Another energy object, and again there is a cut of electricity in the city, but still not as bad as it was yesterday. So infrastructure facilities are damaged, some of them heavily damaged, but they are not destroyed, so situation again is under control. Also, Vinnytsia, there were at least 2 hits, and the second hit was in the same energy asset, energy facility that the first one, and it happened during the rescue operation actually. So there were more people wounded, unfortunately, because of that as well. And of course, so the main 2 main targets basically that we see here, first of all, is critical infrastructure, and secondly, it's residential buildings, because a lot of residential buildings were damaged both yesterday and today, and also civilian infrastructure in general, like a lot of museums in Kyiv, for example, were damaged. Today in Zaporizhia, it was a hospital where missile actually hit. So, I mean, no military objects were affected, neither yesterday nor today.
Also, we understand that he said the counter-offensive attempt by Ukrainian army near the city of Kupiansk, and also I believe this is the Zerebets River and Zaporizhia region, was also thwarted. Talk to us about perhaps what Zelensky has asked from the G7 and what they have agreed, and this is the continued support to Ukraine in this time.
Well, yeah, today President Zelensky, during his speech at J7 meeting, was again talking about the attacks and was talking about the situation, the front line in general. So we don't hear any particularly new information from the front line, but we know that counteroffensive is ongoing. There are some parts of the front line in the east where Russian forces had some successes, but it doesn't really change much in terms of the front line. Ukrainian forces continue their counteroffensive both in the east and in the south. President Zelensky said that this attack that happened yesterday and today that were targeting critical infrastructure, the reaction should be symmetrical. So basically, it should be sanctions for Russian energy sector and energy, energy capacity. So this was one of the main points from his speech. Another one, he said that in order to have peace in Europe, neighboring countries should be in peace. And taking into consideration that Russian Federation is using Belarus territory as one of their bases, and they launch missiles, and both yesterday and today there were missiles and drones that were fired from the territory of Belarus. President Zelensky suggested that it should be a mission, international observers mission should be placed at the border of Ukraine and Belarus in order to monitor the security situation. And probably the third point, what basically President Zelensky was pointing out, and I think this is one of the most important, that Ukraine needs air defense, because as much as possible and as fast as possible, because of course missile strikes and drone attacks, this is something that is the main problem and the biggest problem now, and taking into consideration that the main target is critical infrastructure and civilian areas and civilian infrastructure, it's important that Ukraine has this strengthened. And President Zelensky also mentioned that there is at least 2,400 drones that Russia ordered from Iran. This is what was confirmed, at least by him. And he said that, of course, if Ukraine gets, when Ukraine gets air defense, it's also very important to get enough missiles for this air defense. So this was probably three main points that he mentioned during the meeting and during his speech.
And finally, Anna, we've been seeing difficult visuals of people in Ukraine, their homes destroyed, and a lot of people still displaced at this point. Do you think that the missile strikes, especially on Monday, has dampened morale, civilian morale as well?
You know, there is a great case that probably would be describing Ukrainian morale. So yesterday, well, all Ukrainians everywhere were spending at least half of the day in the bomb shelters. And there is this big charity organization that started a fundraising, new fundraising, which was called like a fundraising for revenge. And during this 24 hours, starting from yesterday afternoon and finishing today in the afternoon, Ukrainians managed to collect $9.5 million to buy drones for Ukrainian army. So I think that this describes a lot the morale of Ukrainians. I don't think that definitely Ukrainians are not scared of this missile attacks. Of course, it's stressful, but people just understand that this is something they have to go through, unfortunately, in the 21st century. And I think that they just get more, they get more courage to fight back, because this is something that it's about their future, and this is, morale cannot be killed by the missiles. And what's also interesting that this fundraising was not only supported by Ukrainians, like ordinary Ukrainians, but also a lot of businesses and a lot of people who are actually now fighting at the front line. So those representatives of the armed forces of Ukraine. So yeah, I would say that people are quite, positive, still positive about their future, and ready to fight until this positive future comes.
Anna, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the program, and continue to stay safe.
Thank you.
Well, eyewitness video captured the moment a group of children sang the Ukrainian national anthem yesterday after the city was hit by missiles in the early hours. It was a video posted on social media. The young children can be seen climbing on outdoor playground apparatus in the residential area. Welcome back. Chancellor Kwesi Kwarteng has been answering questions in the House of Commons on the day of a fresh intervention by the Bank of England. Rachel Reeves has accused him of sabotaging the UK's economic credibility as they clash over the government's mini-budget. The shadow chancellor claimed that Mr. Kwarteng was in a dangerous state of denial as she told the House of Commons that the costs of the mistakes are all too real for everyone else. She said no other government is sabotaging their own country's economic credibility as the government is. But Mr. Kwarteng hit back and said it is very clear that they stand where they stand on this and that they've got pro-growth, pro-enterprise, pro-business conservatives on one side and the anti-growth coalition on the other side who want to tax more and want to commit them to low growth. It came as a Chancellor promised to consult Tory MPs on the measures he will include in his medium-term fiscal plan, which he is due to unveil on the 31st of October. Meanwhile, for the second time in 2 days, the Bank of England indeed has been forced to offer extra support to UK markets, still reeling from the government's announcement last month that it would slash taxes and increase borrowing. The central bank warned today that there was still a material risk to UK financial stability from a sharp sell-off in government bonds that has sent yields soaring, pushing up borrowing costs across the economy and forcing some pension funds to dump assets to raise cash. A slump in UK government bonds that promised to protect investors from inflation, known as index-linked gilt, was the latest source of risk. And staying in the UK, the Supreme Court has said that it would take months to reach a decision on whether the Scottish Government can hold a second referendum on independence next year without approval from the Parliament, British Parliament that is. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, a leader of the Scottish National Party, said she wants to hold an independence vote on October 19, 2023, but that it had to be lawful and internationally recognised. British Prime Minister Liz Truss and her predecessor Boris Johnson said they would not grant permission for any referendum, saying a 2014 plebiscite in which Scots rejected ending the 300-year-old union by 55% to 45% was a once-in-a-generation event that should not be repeated. However, the SNP says the 2016 vote for Britain to leave the European Union, which the majority of Scottish voters opposed, had materially changed the circumstances.
The court has a special function under the devolution legislation. It is possible in some circumstances for the Lord Advocate and her opposite numbers in the other devolved governments and the UK government to refer legal questions about devolution to this court for decision. That is what the Lord Advocate has done in this case. But the UK government argues that that power cannot properly be used in the circumstances of this case, and that even if it can be used, the court in its discretion should decline to decide the question referred. Fourthly, and finally, the court will require time after the hearing to prepare its judgment. The hearing is the tip of the iceberg. We also have more than 8,000 pages of written material to consider. Therefore, as is usual, it's likely to be some months before we give our judgment. Lord Advocate.
Well, over to France now, where French Prime Minister Elisabeth Borne said she had ordered local prefects to requisition some staff needed to ensure petrol supply in the country's service stations as France struggles with strikes at refineries and storage facilities. Borne said the government was prepared to take further action if needed, referring to ExxonMobil's local unit SO France, where management has offered a 6.5% pay rise next year. She said the strike needed to end immediately, adding it was unacceptable to block the whole country. Borne did not announce similar action with regard to the situation at Total Energies, where some sites are also affected by strikes, but urged the unions behind the walkouts to take the hand the company has reached out to them. And North Korea's recent flurry of missile tests were more threatening than before, as they were more difficult for enemies to detect. This according to analysts. The photos released by North Korea's official news agency, KCNA, notably showed a test of a navalized KN-23 designed to be launched from a submarine. This according to submarine expert Moon Kyun-sik, a professor of the Kyunghee University Graduate School of Politics. He said the missile was showcased in a test in the ocean last year, but this time the test was conducted in a way that simulated a launch from what state media called a silo under a reservoir. He says it is the first time in the world. North Korea recently test-fired missiles from different locations and launch platforms, including trains, in what analysts said were an effort to incapacitate the detection system of South Korea and the United States. The retired Navy Colonel Moon added that it's very threatening since, he said, we don't know which reservoir it will fly from.
철도 기동 미사일 체계의 실용성을 확정하고
And it is part of the ongoing effort to establish a gun-free area in designated sensitive locations. Mayor Eric Adams has signed a legislation today establishing how the city will make Times Square a gun-free zone, even as the state law underpinning the policy was overturned in a federal court. Now, Adams said the 56 million tourists predicted to visit New York City this year should not have to live in fear as they walk through the crossroads of the world. In the mayor's words, we will not allow them to live in fear or distrust that someone is walking around with a gun ready to harm them. Now, Adams, who owns 3 guns, said the designation of Times Square as a sensitive location was not intended to punish lawful gun owners. Rather, he and other city leaders said it is untenable to have so many guns in a place as densely packed as Times Square. Maria Bird joins me now for more on this and latest stories from the United States. She's in Washington, D.C. Hi, Maria. Talk to us. How are people reacting to this Times Square, this legislation of, gun-free zone at the Times Square?
Well, most Americans, I think, are a little relieved. As you know, we've had major mass shootings in the U.S. over the past few years. And so having very highly populated areas like Times Square, it does give residents and those visiting New York City a sense of security. Just knowing that if someone was having a mental health crisis or someone has a dispute with someone else, that a gun would not be brought out and potentially killing and hurting the lives of many. Obviously, we know Times Square is such a densely populated area, especially as Americans begin to move back into their everyday lives in the post-COVID era. And so it's, again, a very bustling and busy area.
But Maria, has there been any of this kind of law, one could call it a bylaw of some sort, in the United States?
No, this is a direct response to the Supreme Court's ruling of it being unconstitutional that individuals in New York would have to have proof of either hunting, a need for having the concealed weapon. And so this is directly in response to that being ruled as unconstitutional. And so, as you mentioned earlier, the mayor of New York was a bit concerned about this, especially when you talk about one of the largest cities in the world and one of the most densely populated. And so when you look at that, he is looking for ways to bring security to a community that obviously is also stricken with violence. In the urban environment, you do have increased levels of violence. And so this is one way that he can provide additional security for the residents of New York City and obviously in that Times Square community.
Maria, let's talk about, what we're seeing. Midterm elections are coming up. What's the political tempo in the U.S.?
Well, the midterm elections, I think, are being brought up as being one of the most important midterm elections in recent history in the United States. We know that we are in major challenging times economically. We know that abortion rights are a huge area of concern. We know we're even dealing with race relations at a heightened level than we have prior to the former President Trump's administration. And so when you look at kind of all these things coming together and major issues, and not to mention the healthcare crises that exist, immigration reform issues that still exist, and also environmental protection issues. We are in an environmental protection crises across the globe, we know, but in the U.S. as well. And so these are all major key areas that Americans are focusing in on, and these midterm elections are going to be key and critical because we also know that the Republican Party is also very divided. We also have individuals who are major followers of former President Trump, which does bring a divided tennis between those who are of the Liz Cheney era of the Republican Party, those who people might consider traditionalists of the Republicans. And so when you look at kind of the varied approaches to this, and the Democratic Party is obviously very much embedded with the Biden administration. And so those who have some challenge and might not agree with everything that's happened with the Biden administration might be looking other places outside the Democratic Party to vote for midterm elections. So it is one that is going to be a very tight race in each and every race that we'll see in these midterm elections, and one that will definitely set forth a path to what we can see from the U.S., especially as we head into the presidential elections in a few more years.
So economic challenges, higher energy costs, unemployment, all of these will be impacting the elections. Do you think there will be any surprises? I mean, we heard from former President Trump yesterday talking about the situation in the world. He referred to the Ukraine crisis, the war, and also, talked about a possible World War III and saying, Republicans should be voted in.
This is, as you know, the U.S. has been a strong supporter of Ukraine, was in the forefront of support for Ukraine, and has spent, billions of dollars in efforts to support the war. And obviously, they have said before they will not leave Ukraine. They will continue to support the war as long as it takes. And so, what former President Trump has stated, I think, further just shows some of the dividedness that exists. There are Republicans that are not 100% happy with the way in which President Biden is carrying out the support for Ukraine. Obviously, we know that the U.S. and Russia relations are even more contentious than they have been in the years past. And so that is going to continue to be part of, I think, what we'll see as one of those issues as we get toward the midterm elections, but especially as we talk about what will happen for the presidential elections here in a couple of years.
And finally, before we let you go, talk to us about the latest from President Biden. We know he met with the G7 leaders, especially as regards Russia's missile strikes that, we saw on Monday to Ukraine and other cities there, and also those renewed today. What is he promising? Zelensky has been asking for more firepower.
President Biden will continue to support as it relates to armed ability and obviously additional power as far as ammunition and things to be able to fight the war. The president has also been very clear that he vehemently opposes any type of missile strikes. And so he will continue to work with the G7. And we will probably see in the coming days additional information about the U.S. and their plans to further support. The president is in a very difficult situation, because as we know, there are those who are not as supportive of all the support the U.S. has given to Ukraine, and specifically the U.S. has been very key to say they will not put troops on the ground. And so this is where I think these missile strikes are going to be a very turning point, and we will begin to see exactly how far the U.S. and the U.S. president is willing to go.
Maria, always good seeing you. Thanks for that update. Well, let's take you to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, that has cut global growth forecast for 2023 amid colliding pressures from the war in Ukraine, high energy and food prices, inflation, and sharply higher interest rates, warning that conditions could worsen significantly next year. Well, the fund said its latest World Economic Outlook forecast shows that a third of the world's economy will likely contract by next year, marking a sobering start to the first in-person IMF and World Bank annual meetings in 3 years. The IMF added that the current energy shock, especially in Europe, is not transitory, and the geopolitical realignment of energy supplies occurring in the wake of Russia's war in Europe is both broad and permanent.
The global economy continues to face steep challenges shaped by three powerful forces: the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the cost of living crisis caused by persistent and broadening inflation pressures, and the slowdown in China. Our global growth forecast for this year is unchanged at 3.2%, while our projection for 2023 is lowered to 2.7%, 0.2 percentage points lower than the July forecast. The 2023 slowdown will be broad-based, with countries accounting for a third of the global economy expected to contract this year or next. The three largest economies, the United States, China, and the euro area, will continue to stall. In short, the worst is yet to come, and for many people, 2023 will feel like a recession. In the United States, the tightening of monetary and financial conditions will slow growth to 1% in 2023. In China, we have lowered next year's growth forecast to 4.4% due to a weakening property sector and continued lockdowns. The slowdown is most pronounced in the euro area, where the energy crisis caused by the war will continue to take a heavy toll, reducing growth to 0.5% in 2023. Almost everywhere, rapidly rising prices, especially for food and energy, are causing serious hardships for vulnerable households. Despite the slowdown, inflation pressures are proving broader and more persistent than anticipated. Global inflation is now expected to peak at 9.5% in the third quarter of 2022, before decelerating to 4.1% by 2024. Inflation is also broadening beyond food and energy.
According to Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid, Lebanon and Israel have reached a historic agreement demarcating a disputed maritime border between them following years of US-mediated negotiations. While limited in scope, a deal would mark a significant compromise between states with a history of war and hostility, opening the way for offshore energy exploration and easing a source of recent tensions. According to the Lebanon president, he said the terms of the final US proposal were satisfactory and he hoped the deal will be announced as soon as possible. The agreement is meant to resolve a territorial dispute in the eastern Mediterranean Sea in an area where Lebanon aims to explore for natural gas. Israel is already producing natural gas at fields nearby. It sets a border between Lebanese and Israeli waters for the first time and also establishes a mechanism for both countries to get royalties from an offshore gas field that straddles the boundary.
אני מברך על הודעת נשיא לבנון על קבלת ההסכם. ישראל מעוניינת בלבנון כשכנה יציבה ומשגשגת, וההסכם שאליו אנו מתקדמים הוא הגון וטוב לשני הצדדים. בחודשים האחרונים מערכת הביטחון ליוותה מקרוב את המשא ומתן על הגבול הימי בצפון בהיבט הביטחוני.
And the death toll from Tropical Storm Julia rose to at least 16 on Monday, officials said, with most victims coming from El Salvador and Honduras as the weakening storm dumped heavy rainfall on the swath of Central America and southern Mexico. Salvadoran authorities reported the deaths of 10 people, including 5 soldiers, and at least 830 people evacuated. Footage from the Salvadoran government shows rescuers accessing neck-deep flooded areas to evacuate residents. Authorities in both El Salvador and Guatemala also cancelled school classes. In Guatemala, the Seismology, Volcanology, Meteorology and Hydrology Institute's General Director Wilson Garcia said the groundwater saturation could last up to 72 hours or more. Julia made landfall Sunday on Nicaragua's Caribbean coast before crossing onto the Pacific Ocean. The Miami-based NHC estimates Julia's maximum sustained winds at about 35 miles per hour, with a center located some 35 miles northeast of Puerto San Jose, Guatemala, on the Pacific coast. first funeral services are being held today for victims of an explosion at a service station in Ireland that left 10 people dead. Fashion designer Jessica Gallagher, 24, was the first to be laid to rest this afternoon at St. Michael's Church following Friday's blast in Crushlow, Co-Degol. Now, mass for another victim, 49-year-old Martin McGill, who was originally from Scotland, will be held at the church later on today. Hundreds of mourners attended the first service where 10 red candles were lit to represent the victims of the tragedy, which has shocked the whole of Ireland. Everyone who met Jessica who said they knew her with a radiant smile, expressed sincere and heartfelt sympathies to the family. A framed photograph of Jessica and a shirt she had been making, one of her first fashion commissions, were also brought forward at the start of the service and placed on the casket. It's the first funerals held for Irish explosion victims. Let's go over to Egypt, where prominent Egyptian archaeologists have renewed a call for the return of the Rosetta Stone from the British Museum to Egypt 200 years after the deciphering of the slab unlocked the secrets of hieroglyphic script and marked the birth of Egyptology. Well, the archaeologists' online campaign has gathered 2,500 signatures so far and aims to tell Egyptians what has been taken from them. According to Monica Hanna, acting dean of the College of Archaeology in the Egyptian city of Aswan.
The Rosetta Stone, dating back to 196 BC, was unearthed by Napoleon's army in northern Egypt in 1799. It became British property after Napoleon's defeat under the terms of the 1801 Treaty of Alexandria, along with other antiquities found by the French. It has been housed at the British Museum since 1802. Bearing inscriptions of the same text in hieroglyphics, a Demotic and ancient Greek, it was used by Frenchman Jean-François Champollion to decipher hieroglyphics from 1822, opening up understanding of ancient Egyptian language and culture.
This is the first time there is actually public involvement in pushing the state to act on behalf of the people, that it's not just a request from the government, it's a request from the people. So I think these combined will I'm sure all these objects eventually are going to be restituted because the ethical code of museums is changing. It's just a matter of when, in 1 year, in 2 years, in 3 years, in 5 years, and who will have the courage to take such a decision, who will be able to correct the mistakes of history, and who will, of course, choose to stay on the colonialist, imperialist side. I think it's a telling situation.
A British museum spokesperson says there had been no formal request from the Egyptian government for the return of the Rosetta Stone. In an emailed statement, the spokesperson noted that 28 stela engraved with the same decree written by Egyptian priests had been discovered, starting with the Rosetta Stone in 1799, and that 21 remain in Egypt. The museum is opening an exhibition entitled Hieroglyphs Unlocking Ancient Egypt on October the 13th, which sheds light on the role of the Rosetta Stone. At an event to mark the 200th anniversary of Egyptology, Tourism Minister Ahmed Issa explained how unique Egyptian antiquities are.
Egyptian antiquities are one of the most important tourism assets that Egypt possesses, which distinguish it from tourist destinations worldwide. Tourism is one of the main pillars of the national economy, and it complements many other industries. It contributes to creating job opportunities directly and indirectly. The government aims to increase incoming tourism with 25 to 30% per year.
Egypt is due to open a large new museum near the Giza pyramids to showcase its most famous ancient Egyptian collections in the next few months. Egyptian archaeologists say they have called previously for the return of the Rosetta Stone and are hoping that increasing moves by Western museums to return artifacts that were removed from countries under colonial rule will help their cause.
Well, Lesotho's election commission says the country's recently founded Revolution for Prosperity, RFP party, emerged as the single biggest party after it won 56 parliamentary seats in last week's election, but fell short of gaining a clear majority. The RFP now has to go to court, or rather to court other parties to try and form a coalition in the 120-seat parliament. Now, should RFP, which was founded March by diamond magnate Sam Matekane, secure control of a majority in parliament through a coalition, it would pave the way for a change in government in the southern African mountain kingdom. Lesotho has been marred by years of political instability and infighting under the current governing party. The election went ahead despite a deadlock in parliament and on a whole gamut of major constitutional reforms that were meant to be enacted ahead of the vote in order to bring closure to the country's fractious politics. And Britain's King Charles III and the Queen Consort Camilla were in Scotland today to thank locals in later Aberdeenshire for their work following the death of Queen Elizabeth last month. The King and Queen met locals, including a pair of horses, who took part in the organisation and delivery of events following the Queen's death at nearby Balmoral Castle, September 8. The royal visit came as the UK's top court began hearing a case on whether Scotland could hold a second referendum on independence next year. The case at the Supreme Court in London is to decide if the Scottish-devolved government should organise a vote on leaving the UK without the approval of the British Parliament. Finally on the programme, frustrated motorists queued in long lines outside Tunisian petrol stations today, even after the energy minister had said a shortage would end on Monday with a new delivery of fuel. Many petrol stations started running out of fuel over the weekend as imports slowed and national supplies dropped, leading to lines of cars stretching kilometres in some places, causing bad traffic in Tunisian cities. Tunisia was struck in recent weeks with other shortages too, including flour, sugar, butter, milk and cooking oil. The country faces a crisis in public finances, and the influential labour union, which has branches in government and national supply sectors, says the state has struggled to pay for imports of goods that it sells at subsidised rates. And that's our programme this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Melissa Ntonwaka. Bye for now.